At 9:17 on a bright Monday morning, Marcus Vale stood outside the glass doors of one of the most powerful companies in the city, staring at the time on his cracked phone and realizing his biggest chance in years was probably already gone. His shirt was wrinkled, his borrowed shoes were uncomfortable, and a tiny blue stain from his son's breakfast still marked the edge of his sleeve. He had rehearsed his answers for 3 nights, polished his only good pair of shoes, and promised his 8-year-old son that this interview would be different. But he was 47 minutes late, and the reason was standing several blocks behind him, a woman he had stopped to help when everyone else had simply walked past. If you believe kindness deserves a second chance, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Because sometimes the moment that looks like your biggest failure is secretly the beginning of your greatest blessing. Marcus had spent the last 2 years learning how quickly life could change. Once, he had been a warehouse supervisor with steady pay, health insurance, and enough savings to believe his family was safe. Then his wife, Serena, had died unexpectedly after a sudden illness, leaving Marcus alone with their little boy, Noah. Grief had been painful enough, but raising a child while keeping a roof over his head had been a different kind of battle. Marcus sold his car when the bills became impossible, moved into a smaller apartment, and took whatever temporary work he could find. Some weeks he unloaded trucks before sunrise. Other weeks he repaired shelves, delivered groceries, or worked construction jobs under the hot afternoon sun. He never complained in front of Noah. Every morning, he packed his son's lunch, checked his homework, and smiled as though everything was under control. But after Noah fell asleep, Marcus sometimes sat alone at the kitchen table and stared at unpaid bills, wondering how long he could keep pretending that hope was a plan. Then, 3 weeks earlier, he found a job posting from Northbridge Solutions, a company known throughout the city for paying well and promoting employees from within. The position was operations coordinator, exactly the kind of work Marcus had done before. The salary could change everything. It could mean reliable rent, proper groceries, a better school for Noah, and maybe even the possibility of buying a used car again. Marcus submitted his application expecting nothing. 2 days later, he received an interview invitation. He printed the email twice, afraid the first copy might somehow disappear. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not feel like survival. On the morning of the interview, everything seemed to go perfectly until Noah woke up with a fever. Marcus nearly cancelled, but Noah insisted he felt fine. Their neighbor agreed to watch him for the morning, and Marcus left with 15 minutes to spare. He walked quickly toward the bus stop, holding his folder against his chest while the city came alive around him. Then, just before the intersection, he saw an elderly woman standing beside a fallen bicycle. Groceries were scattered across the sidewalk, oranges rolling toward the street. Several people passed her. One man stepped around the mess without even looking down. Marcus stopped. He knew he was already cutting it close, but something about the woman's trembling hands reminded him of his own mother, and something inside him refused to keep walking. He gathered the groceries, picked up the bicycle, and helped her sit on a nearby bench. She looked shaken and embarrassed, repeatedly apologizing for causing trouble. Marcus reassured her that she had nothing to apologize for. When he noticed she was struggling to breathe comfortably, he called for assistance and stayed beside her until help arrived. He checked the time again and felt his stomach drop. The interview had started 17 minutes earlier. Still, he waited. When the ambulance finally took the woman away, Marcus ran. By the time he reached Northbridge Solutions, the sun was high over the downtown buildings. His breathing was heavy as he hurried through the lobby. The receptionist looked at him, then at the clock, and her expression immediately told him what he already knew. Marcus explained that he had an interview scheduled and apologized for being late. The receptionist made a phone call, listened briefly, and then told him the hiring manager was unavailable. There was no promise of another opportunity. Marcus thanked her anyway, lowered his eyes, and walked back toward the glass doors. Outside, the city suddenly seemed unbearably bright. He sat on a bench across the street and opened his phone. There was a message from his neighbor saying Noah was resting and his fever had gone down. Marcus smiled for a moment, then closed his eyes. He had lost the job before even getting inside. He could already imagine explaining it to Noah that evening. His son would probably tell him not to worry, because children often believed their parents were capable of fixing everything. Marcus wished he believed it too. He stood and started walking home. What Marcus did not know was that the woman he had helped had not been an ordinary elderly stranger. Her name was Evelyn Hartwell, the founder and chief executive officer of Northbridge Solutions. She had come into the city that morning without her usual driver because she wanted to visit one of the company's community projects privately. She had been carrying groceries from a small neighborhood market when she stumbled. She had intentionally avoided calling her assistant because she wanted to spend a quiet morning observing the neighborhood. After the ambulance transported her to a nearby clinic for a precautionary examination, she asked her assistant to find the man who had stopped to help her. The assistant discovered that Marcus Vale had been scheduled for an interview that morning. Evelyn stared at the name on the report for several seconds. Then she asked a question that changed Marcus's life. She wanted to know why the interview had not been rescheduled. Meanwhile, Marcus was back at his apartment, sitting beside Noah on the worn couch. Noah looked at his father's face and knew immediately that something had gone wrong. Marcus told him the truth, but softened the disappointment by saying there would be another opportunity someday. Noah leaned against his father's shoulder and reminded him that he had helped the woman because she needed him. Marcus smiled sadly and told his son that sometimes doing the right thing did not make life easier. Noah quietly replied that maybe it made you the kind of person you could be proud of. Those words stayed with Marcus. The next morning, Marcus woke before sunrise and prepared breakfast. He had barely poured cereal into Noah's bowl when his phone rang. The caller identified herself as Evelyn Hartwell's executive assistant and asked Marcus if he could return to Northbridge Solutions for another interview that afternoon. Marcus thought it was a mistake. He asked whether they had the right person. The assistant confirmed his name and told him that the CEO herself wanted to meet him. Marcus arrived at the company that afternoon wearing the same suit, although he had ironed it carefully this time. He entered the lobby with a nervous feeling in his chest. The receptionist recognized him and smiled. A few moments later, the elevator doors opened, and a woman walked into the lobby wearing a simple cream-colored suit. Marcus froze. He recognized her immediately. It was the woman from the sidewalk. But there was something different about her now. The weakness was gone from her face. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of people. The receptionist stood straight. Several employees greeted her as she passed. Evelyn Hartwell, CEO of Northbridge Solutions, walked directly toward Marcus. She thanked him for helping her when he had every reason to keep walking. She explained that she had learned about his interview and realized he had sacrificed his opportunity to make sure a stranger was safe. She told him that companies could teach procedures, software, systems, and policies, but character was much harder to teach. Marcus listened silently, still struggling to understand what was happening. The interview that followed was not about perfect answers. Evelyn asked him about his years in warehouse operations, how he handled difficult employees, how he managed pressure, and what he had learned from raising his son alone. Marcus spoke honestly. He did not pretend to have everything figured out. He admitted that he was tired sometimes. He admitted that losing his wife had changed him. He explained that being a father had taught him patience, responsibility, and the importance of showing up even when life was unfair. Evelyn listened carefully. Then she told him that Northbridge was not simply offering him the operations coordinator position. She was offering him a supervisory role with a salary higher than the one he had originally applied for. Marcus could barely speak. He asked why she was trusting him with such responsibility after only one interview. Evelyn smiled and explained that she had not hired him because he helped a CEO. She had hired him because he had helped a stranger when nobody was watching. Marcus lowered his head as tears filled his eyes. For 2 years, he had felt invisible. He had worked jobs where nobody knew his name. He had stood in grocery lines counting coins. He had walked home after exhausting shifts because he could not afford the bus. He had watched other parents buy things for their children that he could only promise Noah someday. He had begun to believe that the world rewarded people who were lucky, connected, or willing to step on others to get ahead. But that afternoon, someone had reminded him that goodness still mattered. When Marcus returned home, Noah was waiting at the door. His father knelt down, wrapped his arms around him, and told him that he had gotten the job. Noah screamed with excitement and hugged him so tightly that Marcus began laughing through his tears. Later that evening, they celebrated with a small homemade dinner. It was not expensive. There was no fancy restaurant, no champagne, no grand ceremony. Just a father and son sitting at their kitchen table, sharing food and laughing together. Marcus looked around the little apartment and realized that the walls had not changed. The bills had not disappeared yet. The furniture was still old. The future was still uncertain. But something inside him had changed. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel like a man waiting for life to get better. He felt like a man who had been given another chance. Months later, Marcus became one of Northbridge's most respected employees. He never forgot where he came from. Whenever a struggling employee needed help, he was often the first person to notice. He created a small internal program to help single parents manage emergency childcare and flexible work schedules. Evelyn supported the idea, and eventually the program helped dozens of families. One afternoon, Marcus saw a young employee sitting alone in the parking lot, clearly upset after being rejected for a promotion. Marcus sat beside him and shared something he had learned the hard way: one closed door does not mean your story is over. Sometimes it simply means you are being redirected toward a door you never knew existed. And whenever someone asked Marcus what had changed his life, he never said it was the interview. He never said it was the CEO. He always said it was a sidewalk on an ordinary morning, a fallen bicycle, scattered oranges, and a choice. He had been late because he stopped to help someone. He had thought that decision had cost him his future. Instead, it had introduced him to it. If this story touched something deep inside your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your support helps stories like this reach people who may be struggling silently and need to be reminded that kindness is never truly wasted. And before the story ends, leave a comment with just 3 words: kindness comes back. Let those words be a reminder that even when nobody seems to notice what we do for others, our choices still matter. Because sometimes life does not reward you when you expect it to. Sometimes you miss the interview. Sometimes you lose the opportunity. Sometimes you walk away believing you failed. And then, when you least expect it, life turns around and shows you something beautiful. Marcus thought he was late to an interview. In truth, he was right on time for the moment that changed his life.